Welcome everyone to this webinar on IND applications, so investigational new drug applications to be submitted to the Food and Drug Administration of the United States, to the FDA. We have a lot of attendees online. I'd like to send a special welcome also to the companies that are currently working with us in IND applications. We have company connected from England, France, Germany, Switzerland, Spain, and Italy. And I hope that even though you're already working in IND projects, that you're still going to learn something new today. We will speak about three different points. We'll speak about pre-IND and IND fundamentals, so the basics, and also the US agent requirements. We will have then a session on converting the European INPD, so the clinical trial application file, into an IND dossier. So basically how to go from Europe to the US. And then we'll have a session on ECD publishing, submission, and also some life cycle considerations. And then we have a questions and answers session at the very end. So I think everybody knows how these webinar tools work. Please feel free to submit your questions at any time in the tool. Just type them in, and at the end of the session, we will try to answer as many questions as possible. Please note that this webinar is recorded and it's going to be available online. Okay, this webinar is presented to you by WR Regulatory Services and Asphalion. And let me start by introducing our speakers. We have Mr. Bruce Thompson. Bruce is an independent consultant with over 20 years of experience in the pharma and biotech sector. He has wide skills in product development planning, regulatory strategy, and project management. And prior to becoming a consultant, Bruce held various industry positions, including being Director of Regulatory Affairs and Acting Director for US Regulatory Affairs for several companies. A lot of you will probably already know Bruce from his company Regulines, which he founded in 2002. And since this year, he's also the Managing Director of WR Regulatory Services, which I will present in the next slide. From the team of Asphalion, we have Vicente Tour. Vicente holds a PhD in molecular biology and is a regulatory affairs director and director of the e-submission team in Asphalion. He joined our company over 9 years ago and has coordinated and executed countless international regulatory submission projects. He's an expert for international ECD requirements, and his team works on US submission projects on a daily basis. And myself, I'm Michael Schaub. I work in business development of Asphalion. I joined the company in 2007. I'm also the director of our office in Munich, and also the account director. And this is probably how most companies will know me. Regarding our companies, as I mentioned before, a lot of you will know Bruce from Regulines. And just earlier this year, the company W Medical Strategy Group, which is a company that specializes in US-Asia cross-border business transactions and business management for healthcare companies, together with Regulines, they created WR Regulatory Services, which is a jointly owned subsidiary. WR Regulatory Services focuses on US FDA regulatory affairs services for pharmaceutical development and commercialization. They provide comprehensive support for US regulatory affairs, US agent services, early stage development support, regulatory due diligence. They have extensive knowledge of the US, Europe, and Asia markets, a broad network across these continents, and experts in their team with over 25 years of experience. Asphalion, we were founded in the year 2000 in Barcelona. We have almost 130 people in our team now, and apart from the headquarter office in Barcelona, we have also offices in Madrid, Munich, and London. We provide services for drugs and medical devices along the entire life cycle of these products, so from early development until the stages of maintenance, and then pharmacovigilance included. Specifically for US FDA projects, like IND topic here that we're talking about, we have done over 70 US FDA projects just in the last 3 years. And we work together with Bruce Thompson since 2005, and we have joint customers throughout all of Europe. So here's information if you want to contact us. Please feel free to reach out to us at any time. And with this, I will pass on the word to Bruce Thompson directly, so he can start with the first session. Let's see if that works.
Thank you, Michael.
You're welcome, Bruce.
You should be able to see my screen now.
Yes, perfect.
I think, great. Okay. Yeah, so thanks, Michael and the team at Australian for setting this up and giving me the opportunity to speak about one of my favorite topics, pre-IND meetings and INDs. Usually we would spend a couple of hours in a seminar room talking about this, but we have made this much shorter to accommodate a webinar. So we'll be going through a number of things. Let me just, and rather than start with pre-IND meetings, I want to start with INDs to start, just so we have an understanding of that. And then when I talk about pre-IND meetings, we'll have a better grasp. So just as a little agenda for INDs, this is what I'm going to go through. What is an IND? Do I need an IND? The different types of INDs. When should you consider opening an IND? Where can we find IND regulations? Normally I talk about structure and content, but we're going to make that shorter, and Michael's going to talk about that more in the conversion session, section 2. I'll talk about timelines for assessment. Normally, again, I talk about clinical hold. Bethenti is going to cover part of that in session 3, and certainly if anybody has questions on those items, we can come back to those in the Q&A session. I'd also talk about IND maintenance reporting. Again, Bethenti is going to talk a bit about that, and I am going to talk about just some other points for INDs. All right, so let's get started here. Just going to move this little item out of the way. There we go. So what is an IND? IND, I think everybody sort of knows those letters, but it actually stands for Investigational New Drug, which isn't a very useful term, but it's an application to test humans with a new or modified drug or biologic. Authorization of an IND must be secured prior to U.S. interstate shipment and administration to humans. So because this is a U.S. regulation, we talk about interstate shipment. That means between the states within the U.S. So if you do something within a state, that's covered by state laws, local laws. But as soon as you ship something across a state line between, say, Massachusetts and Rhode Island, then it becomes federal. You're subject to federal law, and the Food and Drug Regulations are federal laws. So this authorization, it talks about interstate shipment. And essentially what it does is it exempts sponsors from having to have the product go through an approval process in order to ship it and use it in humans. The IND regulations are described in 21 CFR, again, Code of Federal Regulations, section 312. So, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So, do I need an IND, or can I just go ahead and do a study? That's is the first question you need to sort of address. So, under the yes column, anything that's novel, unapproved active ingredients, new or unapproved dosage forms, new routes of administration, new patient population, unapproved indication, and any time that you have an exception from informed consent. So somewhere where you're not using informed consent in any type of study involving humans, you would have to consider an IND. And then in the no category, there's a number of normal things. Certainly if you're using a product as it's indicated in its approved labeling, if it is approved, you can certainly go ahead with the study. Common bioequivalence, bioavailability studies also do not require an IND, but for instance, if you get into complex types of bioequivalence, maybe you're doing an inhalation study with a histamine challenge, for instance, then you might be required to have an IND, and that's certainly a case where you would want to be in discussion with the FDA. Okay, so there's two main types of INDs that we're going to talk about one, but not necessarily the other. The first one is commercial IND. That's the one that most everyone on this call is probably going to be thinking about and be involved in. And the second one is non-commercial or research INDs. This is where you have a specific investigator who wants to conduct a study. For instance, a commercial sponsor may be contacted by an investigator that says, gee, I'd like to use your drug and I want to do it by myself under my own IND. And so that would be an investigator-sponsored IND. And the regulations and the guidances and such, they deal with both of these types of INDs. So you can find information on both of them. There's other types of INDs under these, like subcategories, for instance, a treatment IND, but we're not going to get into those. We're not going to get into those today, those specifics. So when should I open an IND? Well, it usually begins at phase 1, the first time that you're testing in humans, first in human studies. But it could also begin at phase 2 or 3 if, for instance, you're using a currently approved product and you're using, say, a different dosage form or a different route of administration. Perhaps you could start at a later phase. You could start testing in subjects in phase 2 or 3. Or, for instance, a foreign firm might have foreign marketing experience or foreign clinical experience that would support an IND in a phase other than phase 1. And FDA's objectives in reviewing an IND, they change by phase. So in the first phase, phase 1, first in human type studies, they're predominantly interested in just assuring the safety and rights of subjects. So they're going to be focusing just on whether the subjects are protected and whether the risk benefit to subjects is acceptable to go ahead with the study. As you get into phase 2 and 3, then there's another criteria, which is scientific quality. And so scientific quality is the likelihood that these investigations are going to yield data that you can use in a US approval. So in addition to just patient safety, now they're going to talk about study design and clinical endpoints and things of that nature that as they look towards approval, you need to have considerations in those areas. All right, as I said before, in terms of the regulations are specified in the Code of Federal Regulations at section 312. And in there, you'll find some subparts. I've included some web links down here, again, for important documents. So since this will be available and given out, I think you can probably access those. But anyways, when you get to this web link, you'll see section 312, and it's broken into subparts. And subpart A is general information and definitions, but then subpart B starts talking about investigational new drug applications. And it includes information on content and format, maintenance, reporting requirements, those types of things. As you get into subpart C, there's administrative actions, whether the FDA is going to terminate it or whether they're going to withdraw it, or those types of things. And subpart D is responsibilities of sponsors and investigators for conducting clinical work. There's other subparts, but I'm not going to go into that. But what I want to note here is that when you look at this section of the CFR, it is in a format which we'll call the old traditional format. So the language of an IND application has not been updated necessarily to what we would now use to talk about a submission in terms of a CTD format, for instance. So there's a very traditional format when you read through it. It doesn't look like what we submit, but in fact, the content is there. It's just in a different format. So another place that we find useful information on sort of the content and format of an IND is a document called the Comprehensive Table of Contents, Heading, and Hierarchy. And again, I put a link down here to get to it. This document outlines every section of an IND, the current, CTD modules 1 through 5, module 1 being the regional module, and I will talk about that a little more. But the other important piece in this document are the appendices. And in Appendix 1, there's what we'll call mapping of sections for INDs, new drug applications, biologics applications, and generic ANDA applications. And essentially what this does is it takes the old traditional format that you find in 21 CFR, Section 312, and it maps it to the CTD format for each of these different types of applications. So it's worthwhile to look at that to just understand how the information from CFR gets to the CTD applications. All right, there IND guidance documents. There are a lot of IND guidance documents. I'm not going to go through them, but I have included this web reference, and this brings you to the FDA page of all the IND clinical trial guidance documents. And I'm going to reference a couple of important ones going through, but this is a place where you can find all those documents updated too. Okay, so IND content. Normally I would love to go through all the module content and talk about it, but I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to show you from the document called the Comprehensive Table of Contents Heading and Hierarchy. Again, I've shown you the link here, just what the content of Module 1 is. This is the US regional module, which will be different, obviously, depending on the country you're applying these CTD to. It's broken into 20 sections, and the first section is forms. You have various forms you might be including. The obvious one is a transmittal form called a 1571. The second section is the cover letters and notes to reviewers. So this is where you include your cover letter and explain your submission. And notes to reviewers is any type of document you want to put in to sort of guide the reviewers in terms of anything that's complex or unusual with your submission. You can also talk about validation, perhaps, and that may, Patenti may talk about that in session 3. The next section is sponsor information, and then there's references to other applications. So if you reference a drug master file, for instance, you would include your letter of authorization in this section. And I'm not going to go through all these sections, but I just wanted to show you the basic outline of that. I'm going to talk about pediatric in 1.9. Section 1.11 is very important. This is information amendments. So when you make amendments to your IND, typically you might be including a lot of documents in information amendments in this section. Annual reports is covered in 1.13. So there's annual reporting associated with an IND, and all that would go in there. 1.14 is labeling. So any labeling that you're using for clinical supplies, also your investigator brochure. If the product was approved in a foreign country previously, you would include that foreign labeling in this section. And as we go down, eventually we get to section 20, which is the general investigational plan. And that's something that's updated yearly when you submit your annual report. And it outlines what you're going to do generally for the next year in your development. All right, so we compile our IND, and we're ready to submit it. Now we talk about what are the timelines for the assessment of an IND. In the US, there's a standard 30-day review period for an IND in which FDA is going to work, and they're going to get back to you within 30 days, whether to go or no go on this IND. Generally, once you submit your application, from the first day to roughly the 5th day, you get an acknowledgement letter from the FDA. And that acknowledgement letter says, yes, we've received it. This is the date we received it. Here's the regulatory contact for any communications regarding the IND, and also other IND requirements. So they talk about the need to file an annual report, the need to do safety reporting, other types of IND information. They talk about data sets, all sorts of useful information. And above all, they outline that you cannot start enrolling patients until they've done their 30-day review. Generally, during days 3, I say roughly 3 to day 25, you may be getting information requests from the FDA. They're sent by email. If you're a foreign client, they're going to be sent to your US agent. Maybe you may be copied on them, you may not be copied on them. But these are the reviewers going through the IND if they have a question, or if they're looking for a clarification, or they think you're missing a document. They will send out these email requests called IRs, and you are expected to respond to these quickly. And quickly, sort of a sliding scale. If it's early in the 30-day review, maybe you have 4 or 5 days to respond. As you get down to day 25, which is sort of an important day, you may be looking at a 1-day turnaround on some of these items. So maybe FDA asks you to modify your protocol, and you would respond back in email with a modification to the protocol. Right. Then generally during the same period, or maybe day 5 to day 30, FDA may identify what we're going to call clinical hold issues. Clinical hold issues are issues of such a significance that the FDA doesn't want you to go ahead with your study. They're going to put you on hold, clinical hold, and you're going to have to resolve whatever issue it is with the FDA before they're going to allow you to proceed. I think Bethenti is going to talk a bit more about clinical hold issues, but when you receive an email communication from FDA about clinical hold, they will clearly identify it. They'll say clinical hold issues. All right, so you absolutely know that these are issues that you must address within the 30 days, okay? Or they're going to put you onto a clinical hold, and then you need to follow up until they release you from this issue. There are specific guidance on clinical hold, and you can certainly find that in on the web reference that I gave. All right, if you get to 30 days and you've answered your information requests, at 30 days, FDA will generally, depending on the division, send you a safe to proceed or study may proceed letter. They've determined that you're reasonably safe to proceed and your IND will become active, all right? Or they'll place you on a clinical hold or a partial clinical hold, depending on what the issue is with your study. Some divisions don't issue a letter at all. They're absolutely quiet at 30 days. And at that point, I would usually contact them and say, are we safe to proceed? But the regulations say that if there is nothing communicated to you in 30 days, you may proceed from FDA. Otherwise, they need to tell you that you're on clinical hold, or they tell you that you're safe to proceed. So we say no news is good news at 30 days if you hear nothing. And I just want to point out that you'll see a lot of reference to an approved IND. That's not actually the correct terminology. INDs aren't approved. They are active, inactive, or they're on clinical hold. So you need to be a little bit aware of that wording that you use in terminology when you talk about your IND. All right. This is the IND application other. Fees, there are no fees. So this is a difference from FDA and a lot of other regulatory bodies. You can submit an IND and go all the way through and start conducting studies and continue your development for free. There are no FDA fees. The exception to that is if you're working in biosimilars and they've set up a product development fee that covers your meetings. The interesting thing about this fee for biosimilars is that when you apply to get approval of your biosimilar, you get to subtract that fee out of the application fee for the market authorization. So even though you pay a fee here, it actually isn't a fee because it's taken out of a market authorization application fee at the very end, should you happen to actually get to that point. And now I just want to talk a little bit about US agents. Certainly, the FDA regulations require that you have a US agent for specific types of applications that you file with them. And INDs are one of those applications. So when you start thinking about filing an IND with FDA, you need to start thinking about who will be your US agent and who you'll be dealing with in communications with the FDA. Sometimes what you can do is you can use your CRO, your contract organization that's helping you run your clinical study. That has benefits and drawbacks. You can also use a law firm, for instance, in the US, or you can use a consulting agency such as WR Regulatory Services or others that are available to be your US agent. And you need to include a appointment letter in your applications that allow you to use this agent. All right, I want to move on now to pre-IND meetings with FDA. And I'm going to go through, when do you talk about pre-IND meetings? Why would you consider one? Who actually grants them? What type of format they can be in? And then I'll talk about the meeting request, the briefing package that you need to submit. I'll talk about preliminary responses, which is something FDA's implemented in the last several years. Very good thing. I'll talk a little about how the meetings are conducted, and then we'll talk about the timelines for these meetings. So when to consider pre-IND meetings? Broadly, you should consider a pre-IND meeting if you're conducting any non-clinical or clinical studies which might support a US market authorization or clinical development. So, and I know I'm probably speaking to mostly foreign firms here. When you first start developing, maybe nobody's talking about looking at the US market, but it's always a consideration given the size of the market. And so as soon as you start working in preclinical work and you think that this might be going to the Food and Drug Administration, you should start considering about meeting with the FDA. I don't mean, in 1 month, in 2 months, in 3 months, but you should start considering when to have a meeting with FDA. It may not be until you're doing pivotal non-clinical GLP type studies that you finally meet with the FDA, but you need to start thinking about it so you can get it all organized and set up. And again, even if these studies are conducted initially or fully outside of the United States, right? A lot of times, foreign clients will approach us and say, well, we've come to the end of phase 2, and now we want to speak to the FDA about market application and our phase 3 studies. You can do that. That is very late in the process. But again, it depends on the type of work that you're trying to do. For instance, maybe you did a dosage form modification. That's something very simple. And so you were able to go ahead in early clinical studies without having any guidance from FDA. But again, even if your studies are all being done in a foreign country, it's still important to start thinking about considering meeting with the FDA for some kind of guidance and their input on your study design development. All right. Why consider pre-IND meetings? This is just a list of some of the questions you might think about that might sort of stimulate you to have a meeting. So what is the correct pathway, regulatory pathway for approval? Well, it's not always clear exactly how to get approvals. There's always some discussion about what's the correct way. And certainly in a meeting like this, you would confirm your regulatory pathway. Is the product a combination product? Some of this is pretty straightforward. You have a pre-filled syringe, that's a delivery device, so that's a device drug or device biologic. Yeah, okay, that's combination. But supposing that you have a liposome and you can fill the liposome with multiple drugs, different drugs, looking at multiple different indications, is that liposome considered part of the drug, or is that liposome considered a device? And so we come up, these questions always come up when we're looking at products, and that's just sort of an interesting question that we come across. Another thing you want to confirm is your non-clinical development sufficient for your first in human study? Or is it your non-clinical development sufficient for your phase 2, which you might have done foreign clinical studies, and now you're going to phase 2, so you want to make sure that your non-clinical development is adequate. Anytime you meet for a pre-IND meeting, you should be submitting a clinical study protocol. That's sort of the basis for a pre-IND meeting. And then you're going to, talk about patients and dosing level and endpoints and monitoring and analysis, and is that adequate for what you're trying to achieve. You can talk about CMC information for any of the phases or for market authorization. There could be other development issues. For instance, you have CMC changes. Maybe it's easy for a small molecule to move from one site to another, but for biologics, if you're trying to move a finished dosage form biologic from one site to another, it's very involved. And you probably want to look at the timing of the data that you're generating versus your clinical program. Also looking at foreign investigative sites for clinical studies. How do you incorporate that into your IND? And again, does the product qualify for opportunities? There are many opportunities depending on what you're trying to do. And these are things that you can discuss in these meetings and get an idea of whether FDA considers it's going to work, or what they might want to see, or any of these types of issues. And again, the focus of a pre-IND meeting is to file a successful IND, right? So you don't go on clinical hold. And I'll stop there. Who permits pre-IND meetings? There are generally 3 centers in FDA that permit these types of meetings: Center for Drug Evaluation, CDER, Center for Biologics Evaluation, that's CBER, and the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, CDRH. We're sort of going to focus on CDER and CBER in these meetings. Also to note that if you're working on generic drugs, there's also a pre-ANDA meetings program. And if you're working on biosimilars, there's a set of meetings for biosimilar development. Okay, what are the meeting formats? Before we had a pandemic, people wanted to have a face-to-face meeting, and that was one of the formats that you could have. So you could go down to Washington and go into a meeting room with usually a large number of FDA attendees and have a face-to-face meeting. You could also add in participants by teleconference or Zoom, video Zoom. For instance, if you have a limited budget and you wanted to not bring all your members down to one of these meetings, you could do it this way and have everybody present, or just to have people listening in on a teleconference has a lot of value to it. The second format is just a straightforward teleconference or a video conference. That has become the popular way now that we can't have face-to-face. And it's conducted in the same sort of fashion as the face-to-face, except you're not sitting at the table. And then the third type of format is written response only. And this is where FDA is just going to provide you a written response to your comments. They're not going to talk to you. You're not going to have a discussion. And that is something that has been implemented for pre-ID meetings. So if you have a simple type of dosage form, you're making a simple modification, there's a well-known clinical sort of study program for it, there's well-known endpoints, it's a well-known type of transition, then FDA may just decide to issue you written responses only. Or you may just decide that's what you want to do and you just request written responses. Okay, so there's a couple of documents that you submit to get a pre-IND meeting. The first document is called the pre-IND meeting request. And this is a very short document. It could be 10 pages, could be 20 pages, something not even that big. The purpose of this meeting request is for FDA to understand the scope of your questions so that they can sort of determine three things: whether they're going to grant your meeting, what format of the meeting it's going to take, and certainly FDA can dictate that format. They also, based on your questions, will determine who their attendees need to be from what disciplines and divisions. And based on that attendee list, then they can determine potential meeting date based on FDA attendee calendars, right? So there's just sort of the two things that the meeting request does. It allows them to understand the scope of your questions and whether to grant the meeting, and then if they grant the meeting, what date that they can meet on, all right? And so keep that in mind when you put together a meeting request. You don't have to include a ton of information, right? That this is the only objective, and that's sort of what you need to address. And there is guidance, which I'll refer to in a moment, on the content or format of the request. The second document is a meeting package or a briefing package or a briefing book document. There's a little bit of wording around it, but it is essentially the same thing. And if FDA grants you a meeting, then they are going to request that you submit a meeting package for a pre-IND meeting. And that meeting package provides all the detailed information behind the questions that you submitted in your meeting request. All right. Generally, they're 50 to 150 pages, could be more. I've never seen anything less, I think, than 50 pages, but you can have a really simple meeting. It's submitted electronically along with the meeting request. Everything now is pretty much submitted electronically to the FDA. And when you submit the meeting package, you can finalize your questions. So when you initially submit the meeting request, you may have an idea of your questions, and they may be pretty broad or pretty specific. When you submit your meeting package and you have all this data together, you can sort of finalize those questions and revise and modify them. You can't go beyond what you had put in your request. So for instance, if you wanted to talk about CMC, and when you put your meeting package, now you want to talk about clinical study design, you can't do that. You have to stay within the confines of your questions that you originally presented, because FDA would then have to invite additional people from clinical, and those people may not be available on the date that they had requested for the meeting. And you can include your final list of sponsor attendees if it's a teleconference or a face-to-face. But again, that can also be changed prior to the meeting. It's just that they want to see who's actually going to be there, sort of a semi-final list, I would say. And then after you've submitted your your meeting package, all the information FDA needs to do their review of your questions and respond to them. For face-to-face and teleconference or video conference meetings, FDA will provide you with their preliminary responses to your questions. And this is important. It was a wonderful thing that they brought this on several years ago as sort of a discipline to their meetings. So they're actually going to tell you what they think in advance of meeting with you. And these preliminary responses, if they address your questions, can serve as the end of the discussion. So if you think that preliminary response is adequate to address your question, you don't have to talk about that in the meeting, right? And essentially what you do, depending on how many questions, you go through all the questions as a sponsor. You determine which ones you still want to talk about in the meeting. Maybe you had 10 questions to start, and now you have 5 questions that they addressed adequately in their preliminary responses. Now you're left with only 5 questions to talk about in the meeting. And what you do is you look at their responses, and if you want to provide additional information at that point in time, you can prepare something very brief. And what we do is we email it back to the project manager. And then that is what you're going to be talking about when you get into the actual meeting, their preliminary response and your response to that. And what it does is it makes for a very efficient meeting because you know their position going into the meeting. And so makes it a very efficient use of time. So how are these meetings conducted? So typically FDA is not going to allow you to have more than 1 hour to meet. There are a few exceptions if you're working in extremely severe disease or life-threatening disease, and FDA feels that they need to have a longer discussion with you. They may grant you more time, but in general, the FDA pre-IND meetings are 1 hour maximum. And so you should sort of set up your meeting for that time frame. And that information will be relayed back to you in your acknowledgement letter. When they acknowledge and grant you the meeting, they will tell you how long they will give you for the meeting. The sponsor lead or US agent and the FDA project manager are facilitators for the meeting, and they make sure the meeting can begin. So you can either have the sponsor lead or your US agent can lead, and then the project manager, and you do the logistics at the beginning of the meeting, and you sort of say, okay, everybody's on, we can begin, or everybody's at the table, we can begin. And then the meeting starts formally. The meeting is chaired by an FDA staff member, and that could be a division director, an acting director, deputy director, or a division head, depending on the who's available and what the meeting discussion is going to be about, right? And in most meetings, we always begin with individual introductions. We go around the table and everybody says, I'm so-and-so, and this is why I'm here, and this is my specialty, etc. I want to note that presentations by sponsors are generally not used in these types of meetings. FDA expects that any type of presentation material that you might want to show them has already been included in your meeting package. All right, so you shouldn't need to go up there and say, this is our development, this is the studies we conducted, this is our CMC issues. There should be no need for that type of presentation. That should all be in your meeting package. However, when you get your preliminary responses, if you see that it might be a large difference in your interpretation of a question and FDA's interpretation of a question, you may need to have a short presentation to sort of form your question better so they understand it. There could be a complete lack of understanding of your question, or there could be they are absolutely in an opposite direction, in complete disagreement with what you're trying to achieve, in which case you might be able to use a short presentation to bring them back and show them. That is something you do rarely, but you could do a short presentation. Typically in these meetings, FDA is going to project, and I'm talking about video conference now or face-to-face meeting, they're going to project on a screen the preliminary responses and any response that you had back to that for everyone in the meeting to see, and then they will ask you to go forward with your question. Certainly in the teleconferences, you'll just be expected to sort of restate your position, and then there'll be a back and forth from there. The U.S. agent can also assist the sponsor in conducting the meeting, clarifying responses, and making sure that you actually reach agreements. So sort of playing a facilitator role, you can actually use the U.S. agent to introduce the speaker for each question that you're using. But probably one of the things you should not do is you should not use your U.S. agent to address any of the technical issues that you want to discuss. There's an expectation that the sponsor or their technical consultants will address those questions, but usually it's not the U.S. agent who gets into an in-depth discussion on that. All right, now for the timeline. So we'll call day one is when you submit your pre-IND meeting request. Sometime between day 2 and day 21, FDA will send out an acknowledgement that they got your request. If they grant the meeting or don't grant the meeting, the proposed date and time, the format of the meeting will be there, and other types of information. You know, if it's a teleconference, is FDA going to provide the information, or do you need to provide the call-in information? That sort of information will be in your acknowledgement letter. And then as soon as you have the date of the meeting, which will be in that acknowledgement letter, not less than 30 days prior to the meeting date, you need to submit your briefing package or your meeting package to FDA. All right. So typically what we do is we advise clients to start preparing that briefing or meeting package in advance of submitting the meeting request, because it can come very quickly and you might be caught by surprise and not have your meeting package document ready to submit 30 days before the meeting, and that is a real problem because they will cancel. They'll cancel your meeting if they don't get that. And then right before the meeting, 2 to 5 days before the meeting date, FDA will send their preliminary comments. Those will be sent by email. And typically FDA would expect to receive a response back not less than 24 hours before the meeting. They will specify probably in their preliminary comments when they want a response back. And then the next thing is your meeting. Typically, their goal date for pre-IND meetings is 60 days from the date of the request. But certain divisions at this point are pushing that out weeks or months past 60 days. And this is a backlog that FDA has. It's part of the pandemic issue that's going on. But there are certain divisions that are quite backlogged. And so these meetings are being pushed out quite a bit. You can also, if you think that's going to be an issue for you, you can get hold of your U.S. agent and say, look, I want to know if they're being delayed, and your US agent can email, and sometimes you can find out if FDA has sort of a standard backlog and whether they're going to delay depending on the division. And then after you have your meeting, FDA has typically issues their final meeting minutes within 30 days of the meeting. If you have written response only meetings, then in place of the meeting date, that is the date on which they will provide the written responses to you. Okay, pre-IND meeting guidance. The most important one right now is called formal meetings between the FDA and sponsors or applicants of PDUFA. I'm not going to tell you what that means. Products from 2017. I provided a link there. There's also another great document which is called Best Practices for Communication between IND sponsors and FDA during drug development. That is one you should have and you should read. It's very informative about communication. There's also one specifically towards rare diseases, early drug development, the role of pre-IND meetings. That is another one, and I've provided the web links for these. Again, there are quite a few documents for INDs and pre-INDs, and so if you go to the web page I had for IND guidances previously, you'll be able to find further detail. For instance, CMC information for pre-IND meetings. There might be something on combination products, etc. There's information on phase 1 IND. There's information on phase 2 and 3 INDs. So there's just a ton of documents that are available to you. Okay, so supposing you're thinking about having a pre-IND meeting or you want to submit an IND, how do you do it? Who do you contact, right? Well, certainly for CDER, there are review divisions. There is a sheet called a Pre-IND Consultation Contacts List. This is a document floating around. It's not attached to anything. It's updated sometimes, and it has a list of contacts on it for the various review divisions. There's also an Office of New Drugs and Divisions contact information file. I've put in a hyperlink to that file if you're working with the Office of New Drugs. If you're working with biologics, they have a standard operating procedure for regulatory meetings. You can see the list of divisions and contacts, or you can just call them up at their number and say, hey, who do we talk to? If you have a US agent, you can always ask your US agent to go ahead and make the contacts and set up the initial contact for the meeting or for the IND submission. And I think that is it. Yes. All right. I will hand it back to Michael at this point.
Thanks so much, Bruce. That was excellent. Okay. Should be able to see my screen now. The second session is rather short, but it represents a typical situation of a lot of our clients. They have a clinical trial application, so the IMPD file, and they want to convert it to the US IND. Some companies think this should be straightforward, but actually it's not. It can end up in a project that is much larger than a lot of companies think. So starting from the very obvious, comparing the US and the EU regulatory mechanisms, we know that for clinical development, we have the clinical trial application, the CTA in Europe, and we have the IND in the US. Looking in the details, now for the application dossier, we have the IMPD, the Investigational Medicinal Product Dossier, which can have reference, for example, to the investigator's brochure. And here we have the IND in the US. The important difference, as Bruce stated, we have the Ctd structure, the Common Technical Document Structure. And you will remember this document, the CTOC, the Comprehensive Table of Contents, Hierarchy, etc., which explains also the mapping to the Code of Federal Regulation. And you must respect the Ctd structure. Now, your CTA, in many cases, will not follow the Ctd structure. So if you move from IMPD, from clinical trial application file, to the US IND, the main point you will need to consider is that here we have the CTD, which is like a small marketing application dossier in the end. And it's in eCTD format. And we think in the next session we'll speak in more detail about this. The IND submission may also require clinical and non-clinical and/or non-clinical study data sets. Vicente will talk about this in the next session. And there might be also some scientific technical differences. Technical differences, for example, GMP certificates in the US are issued by the company, while in Europe they're issued by authorities. Or scientific differences, for example, non-clinical requirements of FDA may differ compared to European authorities. And lastly, the most natural part is the module 1, which obviously is different because this contains the regional administrative information and is just completely different in the US compared to Europe. Now, if we look at the famous triangles, we have the common technical dossier, module 1 to module 5, just like in a marketing authorization application dossier when you ask for the registration of your medicine. And we have to do the same for your IND. So this follows your Ctd structure that we know very well. However, your CTA, your clinical trial application from Europe, you will have the IMPD, and it typically does not follow the Ctd structure. So many companies will have something like this. The application form is also completely different compared to a marketing authorization application module 1. And now you need to go from here to here. And conversely, if you move from IND to an IMPD, so if for US companies, sorry about that, for US companies that already have an IND and they want to file a clinical trial application in Europe, the conversion is quite simple because they already have all the individual documents that are required. And it's very simple to reformat these documents and then to submit the CTA in Europe. However, if we go the other way around, it's quite complex and more difficult than most companies expect. Now, what do we need to do in more detail? Well, of course, we need to build a new module 1 according to the FDA standards, and Bruce provided information. That is no surprise here. However, for the rest, we have a lot of work to do. We have to write, for example, the tabulated summaries. We have to prepare the modules 2.6 and 2.7, and specifically the non-clinical tabulated summaries. This can be a lot of work, and most companies, when they have a CTA, the tabulated summaries they might have either in the IPD or the IB, they will not match the requirements of a CTD module 2.6 tabulated summary. So this can be a lot of work here. Then we have to write the module 3. We have to prepare this. We have to compile modules 4 and 5, and for these we might need to include the study data sets. And of course, all of this needs to be converted into eCTD format. Now, the good thing is that once you've done all this work, you're actually a significant step closer to your final eCTD NDA BLA submission. This is the new drug application or the biologics license application. So after the end of your clinical development and you want to register your medicine and you have the final version of your IND with all the updates throughout the years, you have already a quite complete CTD, and it does not require that much work to convert it then to an NDA or BLA compared to, imagine your typical IMPD version 7, 8, 9, 10 in Europe, and then you want to write the marketing authorization application dossier. It's a huge step. It's a huge project. So what I'm trying to say is, despite all the work that you need to perform, it's also an investment for you. In terms of looking at it from a document level, you need to move from something that can look like this. So in your IMPD, you can have a single file, a single PDF file, for example, for the entire non-clinical part or for the drug product or drug substance parts. And this now needs to be broken down and put into the CTD sections, and afterwards converted into eCTD sequences. So you have to fix the granularity, and this can be a lot of work. So for drug substance, drug product parts, you can move from a single PDF to 30 to 50 documents. You need to break these down, and importantly, you need to fix the document formatting. And FDA in the United States is very picky about document formatting, and then also how it is included in the eCTD. So that one of the main reasons why an eCTD is rejected is because of document format issues. And logically, you have to prepare also the missing sections, just like I mentioned before, 2.6, 2.7, module 3, 4, 5, etc. And then you publish it in ECTD format and you submit it by the gateway to FDA. So we have a quick practical case. Just imagine you have your company Asphalt Biotech, and you just got approval for your clinical trial application to initiate a phase 1 clinical trial in Germany and in Spain. You're starting after the summer in September 2021. And after the first 2 dose cohorts, you want to extend the study to the US. And you plan to do the IND submission in December 2021. Now you have your INPD and IB, but of course there's some CMC changes and they're not yet reflected in the INPD and IB. So what do we need to do now? And if this was now an interactive sessions, I would take your feedback, but we'll just move forward. And we reach a point where a lot of companies are surprised by all the things that might need to be considered. Such as that you might need to collect and summarize and write the sections for more CMC data. You might need to provide more non-clinical data because FDA requirements are different to the European requirements. You might have advanced with some of the clinical work, and you need to add this to the dossier, to the IND. You might need to include the study data sets. You should think about the ECTD format. Do you have your own software? Do you have a vendor that can offer the ECTD conversion? Are your documents, the individual documents, are they ECTD ready? And who will take care of the document formatting? Can you do this in-house, or do you need to subcontract this to someone? Then obviously you will require a US agent. You could choose to work with a US partner. You might opt for external support, and what will be the costs, timelines, how many internal resources do you have available? So there are a lot of things to consider. And these projects, in most cases, they're more complicated than companies believe, at least the first time they go through these steps. And now just here as milestones, what we see typically, the first milestone will be that you perform either by yourself or by external consultants a gap analysis of the existing IMPD IB to see what is different compared to what you have and what you will require for the US FDA. You will need to also assess the data backlog that you have right now. You will need to figure out who will write or update and also update the CMC non-clinical and clinical sections. You will need to start with the preparation compilation of the module 1 documents, which is not difficult, but of course you need to do that as well. An important point is the granularity change to match the Ctd structure. Like I mentioned before, you might have your INPD with a single PDF for the entire drug substance or drug product part, and this will need to be split into many documents. So this can be a lot of work and a lot of hours doing the document formatting. And in general, document formatting for ECTD readiness is a significant task because the FDA ECTD requirements are much higher than those in European Union. And you might just get your IND rejected because your PDF documents are not up to the requirements of FDA. And then you will also need to check if it's necessary in your case to include non-clinical or clinical data sets for any study that started after December 2017. And lastly, you need somebody to, or internally, if you have the software and tools and people, you need to publish an ECTD format and then do the gateway submission to FDA. All right, and we have a lot more slides on this. We have, I just include them here as backup slides. I'm not going through them, but if anyone is interested, just contact us via email and then we can discuss further details. So we'll just leave it right here and I will pass the word over to Vicente so he can start with our next session, which is on ECTD publishing and ECTD submission. Okay, let's see if that works.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Bruce, also for your awesome presentation. I think you should be able to see my screen, right?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay, thanks a lot. For the sake of time, I'll go quite quick. I will do a selection on this initial table of contents I displayed. I won't go too deep on the Ctd standards. We could be talking about this for a long while, but I would stop on a couple of slides on the IND life cycle, which I believe they are quite visual and quite easy to understand. And finally, a summary on what's coming up new or recently changed on INDs. So first of all, I mean, the ECD standards, I mean, it's already obvious that the Model 1 of FDA for FDA is totally different from the European Model 1. You know that the ICH is the one harmonizing from Model 2 to Model 5, so the scientific and technical content of the dossier application, and the Model 1 is regional, let's say, and it depends on each regulatory agency. Obviously, one important thing, the main message on this first part, I would say that the document quality is a must for FDA. So you would need to be focusing on table of contents and functional bookmarks, not only in the narratives in Module 2 to Module 3, which obviously they are quite easy to get because you will have a team of writers writing in Word, but especially in non-clinical studies because they tend to be all studies. Some of them are even scanned and they've lost all the properties. So this can be a quite consuming source of work before your IND submission. So this is the important thing you should really consider on IND applications because they are mandatory in Ctd and US standards are much higher than the standards in Europe. So the second part would be, this was Bruce was talking about this. Just the picture I think is quite visual to understand. No, you might go to an active IND with the may proceed, or you might have a clinical hold, which can be full or partial. Then you would need to compile a response sequence. This response sequence could be a big sequence. You might need to update not only the protocol or some Model 1 information, but maybe CMC documentation, non-clinical, so could be closer to an initial IND submission rather to an amendment. So this is an important thing to consider. Another thing I would like to stop is the IND maintenance. So which kind of information would you need to submit to FDA once your study is ongoing and your IND is active? So basically you have three main types of submissions. You have amendments, could be updates on the protocol or some other dossier information amendments, like could be non-clinical or CMC mostly. You could have also annual reports, which is obviously sent after the anniversary of the IND, and FDA admits the DSUR format. And finally, the most important thing are the safety reports. And these, they can be done in both forms. Let's say the European form, the CIOMS, or the MedWatch 3500A, which is the FDA form. So those would be mainly the main types of submissions you would be sending to FDA. And this could be basically the life cycle summary of an IND during the first year, from the IND application, may proceed, then some amendments during the study, and finally the annual report, obviously with all the safety reports in the middle, if any. And then just to finish, I would like to consider two main things. One, this is not happening yet, probably a couple of years until we see this, but FDA is going to update the way of submitting safety reports to FDA. Currently, we do them as ECTD sequences. This will be a big change for FDA, but still some time to adapt, but just to keep an eye on this. And obviously the study data the requirements. I mean, this is not brand new. I mean, this is well known for some years already, but important to keep an eye on when your non-clinical study started. This will determine if you need to submit non-clinical data sets together with your IND application or not. So this is important also to consider. And finally, also there has been some updates on the validation criteria, which they will come into force mid-September this year. So this is also important to keep an eye on this. But basically, this is mostly for us, no, for the people who are publishing the Ctd sequence. So this was already published by us in our webpage, and finally this would be a slide on which validation errors are getting into force now in September, and I think this would be it. I mean, for the sake of the question and answers, I think is sufficient to finish off with this. I mean, you can get all the slides if you ask us to provide them. Here you have some resources to get some important documents, and I think with this, thank you very much for attending the webinar, Michael. So
Excellent. Thank you very much, Vicente. And I think for the sake of time, we will just stop right now, and we will answer questions by email. And if any questions come up afterwards by any one of you, just please reach out to us and send us an email. And thanks again to Bruce for the fantastic presentation from WR Regulatory Services. Thank you, Vicente. And thanks everyone for connecting, for your interest. And please let us know if you have any questions, inquiries. We'll be glad to hear from you. I don't know, Bruce, if you want to add anything, Vicente.
No, we would be glad to answer questions. So the only bad question is the question you don't ask. So please send them in. Sorry, I obviously overran my session, but please send in your questions, and we would be glad to answer them for you. Thank you.
Excellent.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you. Have a nice afternoon. Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.